All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Backup Recovery and Media Services, or BRMS Basics, with Stephen McIver. He is one of our IBMI Senior System Administrators here at Service Express. If you have any questions for Stephen throughout the session, please put them in the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen, and we will go through as many as we can at the end of the session. If we don't get to your question, we will add it to the list to go over in the live Q&A at the end of day 2. For any other comments, please use the chat function, which is visible to all participants. With that, I will hand it off to Stephen.
All right, thank you, Brooke. Yep, here's our session today on BRMS Basics, and this is a high-level view of BRMS and for IBMI and the value that it adds. If you have any technical questions, you can save them here for the end. But otherwise, we're just going to learn what BRMS is and what the value is, and just a little bit of the pieces that make it up. So we'll kick it off with, what does BRMS do? Very simply, and most importantly, is that it backs up your system. So you can back up your system without BRMS, but why do we need BRMS to be able to back up our system? One of the key things is that it keeps a database of your backups. So in shops where you don't have BRMS, you may have to keep your own spreadsheet to determine what tape has what content on it, what date was saved, and when I get to use the tape again. So with this database, you get what got backed up. And so you can actually see the list of items that are on the tape that are backed up. Most importantly, you can see sequence numbers, which can make restores from physical tape much, much quicker to do. You can see what volume that it's on. And so BRMS lets you look up, when did I save this? What volume is it on? And so if you don't have the tape in your library or it's not in the tape drive, you can go fetch it from the location and put it in and be able to get it without having to load 10 or 12 tapes to find what you need. And then where is that volume located? So is it at the offsite? Is it inside the fireproof safe? Is it inside the tape library? It allows you to be able to track down that tape, be able to put it in. Or if it's a virtual tape library, it'll tell you it's in the virtual tape library. So then another nice thing is that it keeps track of media movement. You can create retention on your media policy. So you can determine how long you want to keep saves. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But then you just know that whenever you've had a daily tape or a weekly tape or a monthly tape for a certain period of time, if it's reusable again, when does a volume expire and become usable again? It keeps track of that for you. And where will it be moving to next? After it's been in the fireproof safe for a while, BRMS will tell you, hey, it's time to put it back into the tape library to be used again. It creates a blueprint for recovering your system, which is huge because we do lots and lots and lots of backups. And for some of us as administrators, we may never even have to do a recovery of the system. But in the event that you do need to do a recovery of the system, BRMS does produce a report to do so. What volumes do I need to fully restore my system? What commands do I need to run to perform the restore? And am I saving everything to fully restore my system? That's probably the biggest bullet point there. It's nice that BRMS will tell you if there are libraries on your system that aren't getting backed up, that you'll want to include those into your backup. It can do parallel saves. And by parallel saves, that just simply means that you're able to use more than one tape drive. In most cases, was one single tape drive and interface, the bandwidth of it isn't saturated with just using one tape stream. So if you have multiple physical tape drives, or if you've got a virtual tape library and it's licensed for many virtual tape drives, then you can take advantage of using multiple data streams in order to make the best use of the line, not only for faster backups, but also for faster recoveries. And then there's automatic duplication as another cool value that BRMS has. You can set up media policies to say, once I finish this backup, also duplicate it off to a physical tape so I can hold it longer on a different medium that's much cheaper. So how does this all add value? The biggest bullet point for me is that you get your own disaster recovery specialist. Instead of having someone having to keep track of all these things for you, you get this application that's able to tell you exactly what you need to do to recover your system and what volumes are needed to do it. and you get a database for all your backups that's automatically updated. You don't have to update that spreadsheet every time and fat finger something and have wrong data. BRMS will give you the accurate data that you need. When it's paired with a tape library, fully automate your backup. So you don't need to physically load the nightly tape each day. So many times when a customer gets a tape library or a virtual tape library, a lot of times they will implement BRMS alongside it just to add some automation and ease to the whole process. You can shrink your backup times with the parallel saves we were just talking about with using multiple drives. So you can shorten your recovery time objective, the time that it takes to stay in that system backup if it is to fall over. The BRMS network feature is something that doesn't get mentioned a lot, but it's really cool to be able to network your BRMS systems together. It allows you to take a save from one system and be able to restore it onto another one. The biggest advantage for this is being able to refresh development environments. So from your development system, you could say, I want to restore live BRM and point it to your production systems database and say, I want to restore this library from this date, but you're storing it onto a different system, and all that without having to move any tapes around. Even if the tape's already loaded into the library, it'll just slide it in and begin restoring. So once you get that in place, it makes it very easy to refresh the development environment data. Auto duplicate volumes for low-cost storage. We were just talking about auto duplication. It's a cool thing to turn on if you got both a virtual tape library and a physical tape library. Good way to keep those volumes even longer on something that's lower cost. So you see a picture of a pizza here. We're going to talk about the BRMS recipe. So this is the overhead view of BRMS and all the pieces that make up it, as I like to think of ingredients for this recipe. So we got 5 main ingredients that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about media classes, storage locations, move policies, media policies, and finally, this kind of whole completed pizza, control groups. Media classes. So these are required by BRMS. Whenever you have tapes in your tape library and you start using BRMS, you have to do what's called enrolling all of the media into BRMS. If the media is not enrolled in BRMS, then BRMS cannot use the media. And one of the required fields when you enroll is to add a media class. When BRMS, you first install the product, it does its BRMS initialization, and it's going to detect all drives and libraries attached to the system, and it's going to create a class for all the possible media densities that could be used. So if you attach an Ultium 9 tape drive, inside of a tape library to your system, then BRMS is automatically going to include classes for Ultium 9 and Ultium 8, as those are the 2 tapes that can be used by that Ultium tape device. So it's used to inform media policies, which volume to use for a save. And we're going to talk about media policies on the very next slide. That's another field that's required on it to tell it if I'm going to be doing this backup, how long am I keeping it for, and what kind of volume am I going to be putting it onto, and you can specify that with the class. So there's all kinds of reasons to have multiple classes. It's just making separate buckets for media. And an example that we have right here is that, say you have some LTO 6 volumes that are the current tapes you back up with, and you got some old LTO 5 tapes that are still laying around. An example here is that your newer, bigger tapes, you could set those aside in a media class that's called, prod backup. And if you have a media policy and you tell it to use prod backup media class, it's going to pick the Ultium 6 tapes. And if you got another one called dev backup, it's maybe a smaller system of yours, some other test environment, you can call that class dev backup and say that you want to use Ultium 5 tapes for that. And so you assign that class to all your Ultium 5 tapes. And so on your production system, you run that, grabs the Ultium 6 tapes. You run that on your dev system, it picks the Ultium 5 tapes that are smaller and just keeping around to get some more value out of them. Storage locations. It's the location where your tapes are stored, simply. So BRMS, it's nice to have multiple locations when you got actual physical tapes that are moving around. And so, for instance, whenever you have a tape library attached to your system and it's called tape MLB01, then BRMS by default will create you a location called tape MLB01. So whenever you want tapes to be used by the tape library, you just make sure you have them in that location, and BRMS is able to pick them and use them as long as they're expired, or if they're still, if you're appending to an active volume, it will pick that. Many like to use a vault or safe location for setting tapes in a fireproof safe, and you can call the locations whatever you want to. It's always better if you name the location something that makes sense. So you may have it set up to where, and this is going to be talked about on the next slide, move policy, but you can set to where you have a move policy set to move a tape to another location. And then once it's expired, then it can move back into the tape library and be used again. So, and lastly is that you may have the offsite location and store it there. Once it expires, move it back to the other site. So move policies is what is the logic for all that. Tells you where the volume will move after a period of time has passed. So it can range from very simple to very complex. So at the very simplest, you may just have a fireproof safe that you take, you back up to the tape. It's got active data on it. And then you tell the move policy, I want that to be ejected from the library and go to a location called vault. And so if you're running your move policy, your verify move BRM each day, then you'll be taking the tape out of the library, put it into the safe, and then it may not go offsite. It may just simply say after it's been in the vault and it's reached its expiration date, could be 30 days, a year, 7 years, whichever you specify for the policy. Then after it expires, it just needs to return back to the tape library. So when your verify move report for that particular day, if it's been in the vault and it's expired now, your move report will tell you to move that tape back into the library so it can be picked and used again for another safe. You can go very complex with it. You may have it moved to multiple locations. You can say it's going to go offsite for 3 days. Then it's going to come back and stay in the safe for 30 days. It could then go sit on a place called Cool Shelf. And then once it actually expires, and then put it back into the tape library. And so the way that you do that each day, verify move BRM is your command to use. And that's going to tell you each day where those tapes need to move. Now, if you're using a virtual tape library, you probably won't be using move policies. It's always best to get those virtual tape libraries in pairs or send it somewhere in the cloud. And that way the system itself is moving that data across the wire to a separate location. So move policies, these are media policies, are very important to BRMS, and especially when you're implementing BRMS for the first time. It's good to have all this data, and it will actually, if you don't have this data, it will definitely spark some good discussion within your company to decide, how long does the business agree as a whole that we should keep, daily saves and monthly saves and yearly saves. Is there some compliance reasons? Like we may decide that 2 weeks sounds great, but for compliance reasons, we may need to keep daily saves for 30 days if we need to be able to reach back into journals for an appropriate amount of time. So you may decide that you have a media policy that you call daily that holds data actively for 14 days. A monthly, it may be due 365 days. And then a yearly, maybe 2,555 days, or in other words, 7 years. And it also determines the media class to use. And you may have classes for your virtual tapes, your physical tapes, your SafeSys backups, or you may have a class like we were talking about earlier for your older physical tapes that you want to keep on getting some value out of. Another good consideration is if you're doing a virtual tape library and you're using a deduplication process, and let's just say you have multiple systems and you want to have a deduplication group for each of your different systems because they are quite different and have quite different data on them, then you can also set up a media policy, a different class for each of those different systems. So make sure that they deduplicate against the appropriate group, and that if I'm telling it to save, production system 1, that's going to use volumes that are assigned to production system 1 and deduplicate against the right group. So many different reasons, for different media policies, different media classes. And so it determines the location where the media is at. In many cases, you can get away with the default for a media policy, which is just called *any. So it's going to look in any location where it's got that media class and pick that device to use. And other times you do have to be a little more specific, and you can say the exact tape library or tape device that you want the media policy to use. Really cool thing is that you can flag media for automatic duplication to occur after the job is completed. So as soon as the backup finishes, you can have it submit off another job to start duplicating. And even inside of the media policy, you can specify a different media policy to use for the automatic duplication. So your daily, your monthly policy may be set to keep it for 30 days on let's say a virtual tape volume, but you want to keep the monthly backup for a year, but you want to put it onto a physical tape instead. And you would specify a different media policy to tell it to save it to the physical volume for a year. And then speaking of duplication, media policies help tremendously when duplicating old tapes to new tapes. And so there's a very, very super handy command inside of BRMS called dupmed BRM. And the coolest parameter that it has is for setting the expiration date. And you can say it to use from vol. And so if you've got tapes that keep data for a long amount of time, a year, 7 years, and you want to be able to duplicate that data, but yet not mess up the amount of time that it takes. So you want to duplicate that 7-year volume that's on year 3. And once it's duplicated, have it still set to where it's still on year 3 of the 7 years that it has till expiration, instead of starting it all over again another 7 years. And so this is handy for not only for moving up old physical tapes to newer physical tapes, but even if you had a virtual tape library in the past and you get a totally different virtual tape library in the future, and you're not able to link those together to move the data, you can at the very least attach those libraries to the same system and use dupmed BRM to duplicate that data from one system to another, keeping all those retention times along with it. All right, so then finally, we've got all these ingredients and we put them all together, and we're about to put them into the oven to create what we call control groups, where control groups are what you most often use to do backups on BRMS. It's not required. There are handy commands in BRMS like save obj BRM and save live BRM and save BRM for IFS. Those can be used to do kind of one-off backups, or even if you wanted to slide those into an end-of-day backup, all those are perfectly great. But the nice thing about control groups is that it lets you put a lot of these, it lets you customize all these different values. And so you can, it's kind of like a combo meal at a restaurant. If you order the number 1, you know exactly what you're getting. So once you specified all these attributes inside of a control group, you get exactly what you put into it. And that's the result that comes out. So out of the box, you have a couple control groups that you can use. And then from there, I would recommend copying these groups if you want to make modifications to them. You have one for backing up all the system data. So that's a licensed internal code in the operating system. This is the same as doing a go save option 22. So this is a much shorter save of the system, where you're not saving all the user data on the system, but simply licensed internal code, operating system. And you can back up all the user data, and this is all your vital application data. And then also you have a save for backing up the entire system. So this is the same as a go save 21. So fully restore from a disaster is which, if you got a full backup of the system, this would be the great backup to restore from. And so you can back up using predefined list, custom list of libraries or directories, or specific libraries. So you have options there. It's nice that if you make a list in BRMS, then you can specify that list in multiple control groups. Lists are also my recommended way for adding omits. I have an item here for you can add omits from the control group screen to omit things you don't want saved. But sometimes the best way to add an omit is through a list. Just FYI on that one. And so control groups, they have many attributes. One of those is media policies, one of the ingredients that we talked about. Very important to tell the control group hey, this is the amount of time you're going to hold this save for, and this is the media class that it's going to use. Even inside of that, you can tell the tape device to be used. You can say media class, and it will refer to that. So you can use a lot of these kind of custom variables to determine where it gets backed up at, or you can say specifically on the control group, I want to use this particular tape library. You can tell on the control group whether you want it to be a parallel save or not, and how many resources to use. Nice thing is that you may have 4 tape drives on your system, and you can say, I want you to use all 4 tape drives, or I want this save to fail. Kind of the nicer way to do it is that at the very least, use 1 drive if it's available, but say if I've got all 4 drives available on the system, then throw the save onto all 4 of those drives and get that done quicker. Also worth noting is that there's 2 different types of parallel saves that you can do. And one of them involves doing taking, let's say, for example, 1 library and saving it parallel across multiple drives. And then the other form of parallel save is to take 4 libraries and send them each to different tape drives. And so both of them have their advantages and disadvantages. There's some overhead to saving 1 single library to multiple drives, but it's worth it if it's a very big library. If it's multiple terabytes in size, you can save a lot of time by doing that 1 library across multiple drives. If you got a whole bunch of little tiny libraries, that's too much overhead to slide that into four drives. It's better to just send it off to its individual drive. So a lot of times when people want to do parallel backups, it's good to see what the size of all your libraries are on the system, and then tell it to do, stripe that library across all the drives for all the giant ones, and then let all the other ones just go off to an individual drive. Sign off interactive users for the save. So just with 1 parameter, I can say yes or no. And a lot of times interactive users can cause locks during backups. So if you got that set to yes to kick them off, then that signs them off the system. And then you'll have less locks and more chance at success of backing up objects. And you can say save changed objects or save everything specified. So you can either do a full save of all objects, or similar to, just like a save change object, it just only saves objects that are new or have changed since the last full save of the system. I like to call it a cumulative save. And then, or an incremental, in which most time we go ahead and do a cumulative incremental, best way to do it. Save access paths, save contents of save files, save spool files. One of the things that can get you by default, not only on a go save 21, but on a control group full save of the system, is that spool files by default are set to not back up. So every time I set up a new BRMS implementation, I set up a full save control group, I like to say yes to saving the spool files, because better to have them than to not have them and need them. And the access paths, those are indexes, logical files. Always good to have those instead of having to rebuild them, take time after a system restore. And saving contents of save files, that's very specific. There may be a certain library that has tons of save files. You don't need the contents. Save you a lot of time on backing up if you don't save those. Append to same media, or always use a new expired tape. And so it always depends. You may have a small tape library, and you may only have a few physical tapes in it. You may not have enough tapes to fit a full rotation that you want to do. Nice thing is that you can keep on just telling it to append to the end of the tape until it fills up and picks another tape. You may have a virtual tape library that you've carved up 2,000 tapes on, and so you can just easily use an expired tape for every save. You can decide to start the system up after a full save or keep it in restricted state. So it does allow you to say, no, I don't want the system to start back up after this save because I'm bringing it down for PTFs, or I'm bringing it down to have some piece of hardware replaced on it. And so then once that's all done, you can bring the system, do your IPL, bring the system back up and be ready to go. Or of course, if you want the system to come right back up, you can certainly do that. One of the nice things with BRMS 2 is that it makes it easy to schedule full backups of the system, to where the system will automatically pick the tape and do the backup, and you don't have to be sitting right there in front of the system to get the full backup of the system. It's very cool to be able to configure that. Lastly, you can create backups without being a programming guru. So it is nice to, when you got those full saves, you can create a program to nicely end applications and end the system. But at the very least, inside of BRMS, you can say, hey, I want you to do a controlled end of the system, do a controlled delayed end for 15 to 20 minutes before you start backing up the whole system. And then when you want to make changes to the backup, I don't have to change the save lib command and recompile the program. I can just simply go into BRMS or even go into the list that's being used by the control group and add items to it, and I don't have to do any kind of recompiling. All right, and with that, that's the end of the presentation. If we have any questions, I can certainly answer those right now.
All right, we do have a question from Martello that says, are they ever going to put BRMS back in Navigator for IBM I? SQL does not support every feature.
Yeah, so far I have not heard any information of it going back into Navigator. It'd be nice at Common this next month if they surprise us, but I've not heard anything yet. I know they've got PowerHA back. Actually, PowerHA is actually its own web portal now. It's outside of Navigator, but sadly, I've not heard anything about a BRMS portal being constructed yet, and I'm still waiting on that.
Awesome. All right, next one. What if you use a flash copy partition for backups?
Well, flash copy partitions are great for backups, and BRMS it's optional for doing those, but I would highly recommend it for those, and for the very reason of that BRMS database. So you would flash copy to another partition, and you would back up over there. But then, unless you're paying close attention, you don't see what tape it used. And so the nice thing about BRMS is that it flash copies over there, it backs up, it updates that database. And then before it finishes and turns off the partition, it actually saves those BRMS files and sends them back to the source partition, and it restores them, thus updating your BRMS database to see the log of what all got backed up, if it was successful, and the volume and the contents of that tape that was used to help you still keep track of all that data, even when you're doing flash copy.
All right. Next one, when is BRMS going to be integrated into new iNav GUI?
Unfortunately, same as the last question, I don't have that answer for you. I wish I did. Hopefully, somewhere someone is working on that, and I would definitely like to see it. But in the meantime, I know that the thing I like the best about the BRMS and Navigator was how easy it was to get in there and add omits. And the best way to add omits now is to make a list. And in the list, for example, you can actually add the first item to a list to be all user. And for a while, I didn't know that you could even add all user to a list, but you can add in asterisk all user. And then from there, you can add in other entries to say, this library excluded, this library excluded, or this particular objects in this library excluded, if it's something that's just always locked. Because as you know, anytime you have one locked object on BRMS that can't be saved, it tells the entire save that your save failed. And so that's my best recommendation for if you have an all user item in your backup, to then make a list instead that has all user in it and omit those specific objects out of it that are always got the lock that aren't going to get backed up.
Awesome. We've got one more question. When appending backups to a tape, can you tell it to use the same tape for a given number of days?
Mainly whenever you tell it to append, it's just going to find an active tape out there, and it's going to continue to add on to the end of it. If you keep the same tape loaded, like it might be just a tape drive and you don't tell it to unload, it will just keep on appending to that tape until it gets full. And if you got a tape library, then it'll keep appending to the tape, and then it will then be partially on one tape, and then it'll be appending over to the next tape. And so the only way to really get it out of there and not pick it is to change the location of it. So if it's using tape MLB01, if the tape's not in tape MLB01, it won't be able to pick it. And so it can be a little annoying whenever a tape bleeds over onto another tape. An important thing to do in those cases is that in your BRMS maintenance that runs each day to expire tapes, it has an option for asking if you want to expire tape sets. And so if you never set that to yes, then you eventually have this long string of tapes over time. It may end up becoming 30, 50 tapes, and they can never expire because you've told BRMS you can't expire a chain of tapes or a set of tapes. So very important that if you choose to go with the appending method, just keep on appending until every volume is full. That you eventually tell it you can't expire the older tapes in the chain, or else you'll just eventually run out of expired tapes to write on.
Okay, awesome. That is our last question. So thank you so much, Stephen, and you all for attending. Right now we've got a 15-minute break, so feel free to go to the Book a Meeting tab to talk to Hannah at Service Express and book a meeting. There's resources, pop on the Who's Online, see who's on the leaderboard right now, all that good stuff. So we will see you guys back at 11 o'clock for the next session. Thanks, guys.
Thank you all so much. It's a privilege.